Mana and Aneo and Iwi, thank you so much. Thank you, Kia ora koutou. And it's such a privilege to celebrate the International Women's Day on this very, very, very exciting topic, and also our presenter as well. So thank you for those, my female peers supporting all our mahi and looking into a lot more work that we can do. And also thank you to my male peers as well, supporting us in many of our dimensions, both personal and also on the work front. So my name is Kini Choi. I'm Chief Executive of NZIER. It's a huge privilege here to have Sharon, my ex-colleagues from MB, looking into a slightly different topic outside of geothermal, but importantly relevant to us. So the format for today is that I will ask Sharon to introduce herself and then give her presentation on the topic that you can see on your screen, and then probably about 20 to 25 minutes presentation. And then I'm going to open up the floor for any questions or comments. So you can type your questions or comments in the chat box, and then we'll then run through some of those. And then I'll ask Sharon a couple of her personal questions, asking her something that we want to know more about her on a personal level, and then we will close. So that is probably take about 40-45 minutes, depending on the topics and also the questions. So without further ado, welcome Sharon. Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us today. So the geothermal community and also our friends would be very interested to learn more about the great topic that you're going to present today. So I'll hand over to you, and please introduce yourself and then lead us through your presentation. Thank you.
Kia ora koutou katoa. It's great to be here today to talk to you about this research that I've done on the topic of what would it take to mobilise investment to achieve New Zealand's climate goals. So just to introduce myself, I'm Sharon Pells. I've been at MB for a while, and I work in the Chief Economist Unit, which is in the sort of strategic planning part of MB. I think we'll get into the content of the presentation. So cutting to the chase, what did we find from this research? We found that there are lots of things that work against climate investment, and I'll come on to some of those shortly, and that despite the fact that climate investment has grown a lot in recent years, most estimates conclude that it's vastly inadequate in terms of achieving climate goals. There are some positive developments in New Zealand, and in particular, some long-term policies have provided greater certainty. And that's really important for something like climate investment, because uncertainty tends to be the enemy of investment. And there's also been quite a lot of momentum towards mitigation investments, but much less progress has been made on adaptation investment. And this is in New Zealand and elsewhere. Overall, a key finding is that policy needs to be goal consistent and coherent. So we found that investors are quite keen to pick up on policy inconsistencies, and this can undermine the motivation to invest. So I'm just going to talk briefly about some background to this study, what we did and why we did it. So as I've mentioned already, the key question in this study was what would it take to mobilise investment to achieve New Zealand's climate goals? And this question was triggered by a statement by Rod Carr, the chair of the Climate Change Commission, who said in the context of COVID-19 that building back better would involve investment having a focus of climate change. For investment, and we thought that was quite an interesting thought experiment that could help in a policy context, and so that was the focus of our research. So the motivation for the research is that climate investments is a key enabler to achieving climate goals, but there were known challenges. So we wanted to understand what some of the solutions were in the New Zealand context. And ultimately, the purpose was to inform policies around achieving New Zealand's climate goals. So what did we do? We did an international literature review, mainly looking at policy developments, but also other things related to climate investment. But the sort of guts of the study was interviews with 33 key informants. And these were people who had expertise and knowledge of climate science, climate investment and its financing, affected industries and groups, that type of thing. And so specifically, we were talking to industry associations, peak bodies, financial institutions, iwi, research institutions, government, local government and central government, and overseas experts, and in particular from Europe, where there's been quite a lot of progress in climate investment. And the scope included both mitigation and adaptation, climate investment and its financing, and public and private investment. And I'll just come on to what we mean by some of those things shortly. So what are we talking about when we're talking about climate investment? So in general terms, as you probably know, investment is about giving up something now to get benefits in the future. And in this context, we're talking about climate investment. So it's about mitigation or reducing emissions, or adaptation or adapting to the effects of climate change. And just to give you a few examples, on the mitigation front, some examples of climate investment would include things like clean energy systems, clean business models, low emissions technologies, that type of thing. So both tangible investment like buildings, machinery and equipment, but also intangible investments like technologies and business models. And on the adaptation front, we're talking about climate resilient infrastructure, but also investment or sort of machinery, equipment or infrastructure that can help adapt to the effects of climate change. So things like flood protection systems and that type of thing. And obviously that's top of mind at the moment with things like Cyclone Gabrielle. And in fact, you'll see that even though this study was done about a year ago, some of the findings are quite prescient in the light of the recent floods, etc. And then, in case you're not familiar with them, these are our climate goals. This study was about achieving climate goals. So the mitigation goals are about net zero emissions of long-lived gases by 2050 and reducing biogenic methane emissions or short-lived gases by 24 to 47% by 2050. And this reflects New Zealand's unusual emissions profile. So about 50% of our gross emissions comes from agriculture, and that's very high compared with most countries. And then this slide just sets out also the adaptation goals. So let's turn now to the findings. What do we find from this study? And first of all, I want to talk about the findings from the literature review. So that first bullet, there were lots of things that work against climate investment. And I'm not going to go into sort of those in detail, but basically the takeout is that it's quite hard to shift investment patterns away from sort of fossil fuel-based investment towards low emissions investment, for example, or towards adaptation investment. And therefore, unsurprisingly, global climate investment to date has been quite limited. There has been quite strong growth. So, for example, on the financing side, green bonds have increased very rapidly, but from a low base, and they still only account for about 1% of the global market. One authoritative source in this area is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and they estimated that annual average mitigation investment would need to increase by a factor of 3 to 6 fold over the period 2020 to 2030 to limit warming even to 2 degrees, let alone 1.5 degrees. Just moving to the next point, there's a very strong case for government intervention, and this relates mainly to the fact that emissions have lots of effect on people and businesses beyond the emitting business themselves. And so that's one of the main reasons for government intervention, but there are also lots of other market failures in this area. But there's a problem in terms of government intervention, and that's that we'd rather that other countries did the hard work rather than us do it. So that's a free rider problem. That's another challenge in this area. And the international studies basically come to the conclusion that you need a robust carbon price to incentivise climate investment, but you also need to do lots of other things to overcome system inertia. And this is particularly true in terms of trying to support sort of young or new industries and technologies where, you know, there might be quite a lot of structural things that favour incumbents. And New Zealand's at the start of our climate investment work. So let's now turn to the findings from the interviews with our key informants. And first of all, the mitigation investment findings. So as I mentioned before, some recent policy developments have been quite supportive of this. In particular, things like the Zero Carbon Act, the Climate Change Commission, the establishment of that with a long-term independent view, that's provided more clarity around policy. And that's really important for investment because you need that certainty for investment decision making. I don't know whether you guys are familiar with this, the new climate-related financial disclosures regime, but this is basically where the largest companies and also financial institutions in New Zealand have to disclose their climate impacts. And some of the financial organisations that we spoke with talked to how they're sort of resourcing for this, they're gearing up, they're assessing businesses on their books, they're developing new products like green mortgages, sustainability linked financing, and ultimately they've got to decide whether they're going to keep sort of emitting companies on their books or help support them through the transition. Another positive in New Zealand is that there's quite a lot of opportunities seen for things like clean tech, which I think is sort of relevant to your, the energy markets and the areas you're interested in. And this reflects that the carbon price is generally seen on an upward trajectory. Another interesting thing from this piece of work is that people tend to focus on climate finance, but we found in this study that there was more concerns around the sort of demand side. In other words, creating an environment conducive to climate investment through regulations, trying to stimulate demand more than supply side issues like climate finance. Having said that, there were some gaps in climate finance, and in particular, it was about supporting new technologies which aren't yet commercialized. So there's some support for R&D, some obviously science investment and that type of thing, but it's that sort of valley of death where things can struggle. And some of the suggestions included a risk guarantee type instrument. And then overall, despite this momentum, the key informants identified much more that needs to be done around mitigation investment to be consistent with climate goals. And that's the key point. Even though things are moving in the right direction, much more needs to be done to be consistent with climate goals. And these are some of the things. I'm not going to go through them in detail, but just to say that I'm going to pick up on a few that I thought might be of special interest to you. So on the right incentives, I've already touched on the carbon price, but key informants talked about things like the resource management reforms, streamlined planning processes, expediting offshore wind regulations, and also about the structure of the energy market and whether it's conducive to climate investment. And again, this goes to the point about stimulating demand for climate investment amongst businesses and also households as well. And picking up the point about the increased scale and pace of investment, Some of the things that key informants touched on lots of different areas, but in the energy space, they talked about the need for increased electricity capacity to respond to things like EVs and growing demand in that area, and also about solar and onshore and offshore wind developments as well. And then finally, I want to discuss the system-wide change point at the bottom. And that reflects the point that it's quite hard to shift investment patterns. And just to give you one example here, one of the key informants we spoke with talked about his conversation with a farmer. And this farmer was considering setting up a quinoa farm, which is, and quinoa is relatively low emissions sort of product. And basically the farmer was saying that, you know, he was struggling to sort of link in with other farmers, so there was a coordination problem. It was difficult to get finance because banks weren't familiar with, you know, the quinoa farming. And a range of other barriers to investment in that area. And he said basically it would have been much easier to set up as a dairy farm. So I think that sort of illustrates some of the sort of systemic challenges that face around climate mitigation investment. Let's turn now to adaptation investment. And basically the story here is a less positive one than for mitigation investment. And in particular, this point about fewer opportunities seen for private investment. So for example, some of the key informants we spoke with talked about things like seawalls. And these were seen as quite an unattractive proposition from a sort of financing point of view. Also, there are a range of challenges to adaptation investment. So, I mean, we're seeing that play out with the cyclone. So there's things like loss aversion and reluctance to invest in sort of new areas or developments in low risk areas. Having said that, some of the climate scientists we spoke with talked about the benefits of adaptation investment, and in particular, the fact that, you know, climate resilient infrastructure is less prone to climate risks, avoided damages, that type of thing. So there are obviously benefits from adaptation investment. New Zealand faces challenges in terms of managed retreat and relocating affected communities. And again, we're seeing that play out now. And overall, key informants felt that far more needs to be done on adaptation investment. And this reflects that less progress has been made, but also that adaptation investment directly affects the well-being of New Zealanders, whereas the benefits of mitigation investment tend to be more diffuse. There was quite a bit of discussion around who should pay for adaptation investment. And the views range from quite a hard-nosed view that basically if the benefits are private ones, so for example, if a seawall or whatever protection system benefits some local households, then they should pay for that investment. And also about the use of price signals, that you don't want to dilute the price signals from rising insurance premiums or from the effects of property values. You don't want to dilute that because it basically shifts investment over time towards lower risk areas. So that was one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum was that government's likely to have to come to the party eventually anyway. So it's better for government to be involved early to avoid a maladaptation. And just to give you a sense of the scale of some of this investment. So we spoke to some key informants who'd done a back of the envelope calculation about one community facing managed retreat. And they'd calculated that they'd totted up that the value of buildings and infrastructure in that community was around $10 billion. So it gives you a bit of a sense of the scale of what needs to be done. So what would it take to mobilise adaptation investment? You might notice that this list actually is a bit shorter than the one for mitigation investment, and that's because we're not repeating some of the same themes. So some of the same things apply, like the system-wide change, that type of thing. But also the themes for adaptation investment tended to come through a bit more strongly, and in particular that first point about granular accessible data. And this is data to inform investment decisions of businesses, farmers, households, local councils, that type of thing. And there was a concern that not all that data is publicly available, and also that there isn't a single source of truth. So there was a lot of discussion around data on climate risks, and also disclosing information about climate risks. So in Europe, there's much more disclosure of climate risks, and again that informs investment decisions by households and businesses. And then there was a bunch of things around local government, around having a clear mandate, about local planning being more anticipatory and taking account of climate risk, so building in low risk areas and also managed retreats. Community engagement should sort of balance top of mind issues for people, but also try and avoid maladaptation. So councils are having some hard conversations around adaptation, basically. But I don't want you to go away thinking that adaptation is only a local government problem, because key informants said that private sector, central government, etc., play a key role in adaptation investment. And in particular, that point about clarity around who pays for what is important. Early clarity on that is really important, and that the scale and pace of investment needs to increase substantially. So let's wrap up and talk about the implications of this piece of work. So basically, we did this, as I mentioned, to inform policy. This is one of lots of studies that inform policy around climate investment and this type of area. But in particular, it was to inform the emissions reduction plan and national adaptation plan. And just to say that we've had quite a lot of interest in this project amongst government agencies. So Treasury, for example, who are leading the funding and financing chapter of the emissions reduction plan, they're leading work on that. We spoke with quite a few teams in Treasury, but also other agencies as well, ministries for the environment, and some private sector organisations were interested in this work as well. And then just the point that we're, just to conclude, that we're moving in the right direction, but much more needs to be done around adaptation investment, and that investors were quick to pick up on any policy inconsistencies. These are the names of the reports. They're quite long and detailed, but I do encourage you to take a look. If you're interested in a particular topic, then hopefully you should be able to find that quite quickly within the report. So there's a lot of rich detail that I obviously haven't had time to cover today. Then happy to move on to questions.
Thank you, Carola, Sharon. Thank you so much. I'm sure that there will be a lot of content and also commentary that you're able to share with the audience here today. So audience, so if you have any questions or comments or any thoughts, please turn on your video or put your hand up or write that in your chat box. So maybe I'll just start maybe just a question so that while the attendees are considering some of those. So Sharon, you talked about the focus or the imbalance between mitigation and adaptation investments, and sometimes that is important, but also so from your conversations and your analysis, are you able to perhaps give us what are some of the areas that this might be a barrier?
Oh, it's a barrier to what adaptation in particular. Yeah, so I think adaptation. So one of the things around adaptation is so there's quite a lot of behavioural issues, and in particular loss aversion is one thing. So people are reluctant to acknowledge the risks of climate risk. It's hard for people to get their head around some of the challenges around climate change, and it's hard for them to know what to do. So there's quite a lot of behavioural challenges around adaptation, in particular loss aversion, and we're seeing that play out with the cyclone, aren't we, where communities are reluctant to move to really get their heads around that long-term risk. So I think that's one of the challenges to adaptation. Yeah, I'm just trying to think what else. I mean, there's some general challenges. So there's things like lock-in is a general challenge to climate investment, and that's basically where existing patterns are sort of perpetuated. So yeah, so investment patterns. It's hard to move, investment from, the current investment towards, more low risk infrastructure, that type of thing. So that's another challenge.
Right.
Yeah.
So the next question is that, in your assessment, you talked about the New Zealand investment environment, and you touched on about some of those investors and also consumers in your case.
Yes. Yeah.
Have you spoken to any of the banking financial institutions looking at, they have got some instruments promoting sustainability or giving loan in lower interest rates to help them to give it?
Yes.
Are you able to share with us some of those in your research?
Yeah, so some of the things they talked about, they talked about some of the products that they've got. So for businesses and consumers, there's things like green mortgages, which offer lower interest rates. There's sustainability linked financing. So that's basically where there are sort of fish hooks. If firms achieve sort of environmental goals, they receive lower rates than, and if they make improvements in terms of their emissions, they receive lower rates than they would otherwise receive. But one of the things that that the financial institutions pointed out to us is that some of these products have benefits, not just their benefits to society as a whole, and so why should they be sort of offering these products when again the benefits are quite diffuse? So that was quite an interesting discussion on these financial instruments. And we also spoke to I think it's called the Green Bank, the bank in Europe. I can't say what that particular respondent said, because that would be breaching confidentiality points. But there is some material in the report about sort of developments in Europe, and I think the fact that we've got that Europe's got that sort of set up means that there is I think probably a more careful consideration around where the benefits of some of these financial products fall, whereas obviously banks in New Zealand have a strong commercial interest, don't they? So I think that's where some of that conversation was going, really.
Okay, so my last question about the presentation. So we have got a number of our geothermal association and our friends attending this today, and also people will be watching this webinar later on. What would be your key message to the geothermal or / renewable energy sector after your evaluation of all the different players in the investment market?
Yeah, so I think that some of the key messages around the energy, the energy market were basically, well, first of all, that carbon, there was quite a lot of discussion around, you know, opportunities for clean energy investment, you know, with the increases in that we're seeing in the price of carbon. But also there were some impediments. There was something around the structure of the energy market, and key informants didn't go into this in detail. Obviously, we were spanning lots of different topics, and we were asking quite an open question about what they saw as the, you know, the main sort of you know, the main strategies to improve climate investment. But they did touch on the structure of the energy market might be sort of not conducive to climate investment. So I don't know whether people in this, you know, in the audience might have a view on that around the structure of the energy market, because we didn't get a lot of detail on that, but that was something that did come up in the context of energy.
Right. Okay.
So yes, I don't know whether that would make sense to you guys, that comment around the structure of the market.
Okay, so that might be something that we can take it away and then explore it further in our public events.
Yes,
and
that's
also
right.
maybe
I mean,
having more thoughts about this. But if audience have got any thoughts or comments about it, please turn your video on, and then we can then share your thoughts. So now turning to my favorite part of the webinar. So I want to learn more about you, Sharon. I know that I've worked with you before, but okay. And I will be really keen to learn more. So first question, as an economist, what would be your favorite book that you will recommend to us to read?
As an economist? Oh, hard to say, really. I have to say I'm not, although I read a lot and I do read a lot of literature, I don't really read a lot of economic textbooks. I have to confess. One I've read quite recently that that people might be interested in is Mariana Mazzucato's, the one about the sort of moonshot, where basically Mariana Mazzucato argues that we're facing lots of global challenges like climate change, and she's arguing for a mission-based approach to innovation. So that might be something that's quite interesting to your audience. So yeah, that's an, and also you, Kenny, from a science point of view, she's arguing that, you know, like the moonshot, you know, there was a lot of resources corralled around that, you know, a common goal. And the thing with, as you know, with science is you don't know where the benefits are going to land. Certainly basic research, you know, the benefits are quite diffuse. But if you're going to invest in science, you might as well invest it in an area where there is a big challenge like climate change. So that's the sort of basic argument, and that a missions-based approach is quite helpful. And again, that goes to some of the issues that we picked up in this study about the private sector and public sector working together in these challenging areas.
Oh, thank you. Okay, last question. Okay, and I know that you also listen to a lot of music and very different types. Can you tell us what is your favorite music band?
Probably my favorite artist, and this is showing my age, is Dead. And that's I like one of my favorites is Nina Simone. I like jazz, that type of thing. But also I like, I mean, I do like, I mean, again, I'm not going too far forward, but I also like U2 and some, you know, rock bands and that type of thing.
Oh, right. Fantastic.
They're probably showing my age a bit there, Kenny.
No, not at all. Okay, so I'm just going to turn to our audience today. Are there any comments or questions from our audience? Okay, so thank you, Sharon, and thank you everyone for participating today. It's a huge privilege to learn about your work and also more about you. And I'm sure that we'll see each other in Wellington. But all the very best. And I want to continue our connections. If there's anything the association could offer in your work, please do reach out to us. And also conversely, we will also value your inputs to our work as well.
Okay, well, thanks for the opportunity, Kenny.
So yeah, thank you so much. So nonera tena koutou, tena koutou, tena koutou katoa. Thank you, everyone. Okay, have a nice afternoon. See you.